Thanks for tuning in to hear this. We're going to talk about Kantian ethics, Kant's moral philosophy. Right. So, who was that? Where did he live? There he is. That's one of the standard portraits of him. He lived. So those are his dates. It's worth thinking about, remembering what else was happening, right? So back end of the 18th century. And of course, the big thing that happened in the 18th century was the French Revolution. So that's what, 1789. So that coincides with his period of productivity. So you can see he was born in 1724. He doesn't start writing any of the canonical stuff until the 1780s, right? So he's almost 60 by the time he writes the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. What did he do in his life? Well, he never married. He just taught philosophy. He was one of the first full-time professional philosophy teachers. And he never left Königsberg, right? He lived a short way away for a bit. He was a teacher in a town near Königsberg for a while, but he didn't travel the world. He didn't visit Paris or, St. Petersburg or anything like that. He wasn't somebody like Leibniz, who was always hanging around in one capital city or another. So I've got the dates of some of his big books. I mean, you don't need to memorize them, but if you're tempted to sort of do a bit of reading around all this, What is Enlightenment? Sort of short essay that he wrote that gives you a sense of his kind of orientation. You get a strong sense of him as an Enlightenment figure, but also of the kind of political conditions that he was writing under. Let's see what else we got. Yes, eventually he was banned from writing about religion. He wasn't a religious philosopher in the way that somebody like Kierkegaard was, right? Somebody who writes a lot about faith. But as we'll see, there's a kind of religious background to, even though he's kind of arch rationalist, there's a kind of religious background to it. And just before we move on, notice he lectured on mathematics, physics, logic, metaphysics, geography, and earthquakes. So he didn't just lecture on philosophy as that discipline is defined now. He was very kind of sciencey in his lecturing, the range of things that he lectured on. Just before we move, we will move on in a moment. If you're doing the rational proofs of the existence of God, and you will know that one of the places that you meet Kant is that Kant says that that those rational proofs can't work, and he makes that argument in the Critique of Pure Reason. You see there, 1781. You remember, for example, he says about the ontological argument that existence isn't a predicate, right? If you say I want to buy a coat, I want one that's rainproof, I want one that's long enough to reach my knees, I want it to be blue. Oh, and give me one of those ones that exist, right? You're not adding anything by saying, give me one of the ones that exist. Okay, so here's the map. I knew I had a map somewhere. So where is Königsberg? This here is It's now called Kaliningrad. It's this little Russian enclave between Lithuania and Poland. All of this area, most of it, well, this bit up here on the Baltic, which is now Poland and Kaliningrad, this was all the Prussia. I was going to say it was German speak, but it was German governed. Of course, there were people speaking Polish, people speaking Czech, people speaking Russian. And at different times in history, different countries were able to control it. And so the governments would speak one or other of those languages. In Kant's lifetime, the ruling power was the Prussian king. And so German was the language. If you're studying the Second World War, you know, if you wonder why the Nazis were all fired keen to invade Poland, well, because in their minds it was still Prussia, right? There's a kind of, you know, okay. So, what is morality according to Kant? Right? Well, here's a little list. It's a priori because it's necessary. Right? It's necessary. We don't get to debate what is the moral truth, and it doesn't vary from place to place. It's true because it's true. It's a bit like mathematics in that sense, right? So it's a priori because it's necessary. So remember that a priori is how do you find out about it? A priori is the epistemic categorization, right? So you can find out what is the moral truth simply by thinking without having to do any experiments. But it's not analytic, right? So the idea, an analytic just means it's simply a matter of definition, right? This idea that there can be knowledge, there can be truth, which you can know a priori, but which is more than merely definitional, that's Kant's whole project in metaphysics and in ethics. Morality is universal, so it's given to all rational creatures. It's not that some people have moral responsibilities and others don't, or some people have different moral responsibilities from each other. I mean, if you think about the historical context, the idea that men have different moral responsibilities from women, that the nobility have different moral responsibilities from peasants, that's going to be the common sense, right? For most of human history, that was the common sense. So the idea that morality is the same for everybody. Why? Because morality isn't anything to do with your social position. Morality arises simply out of the fact that you are a rational agent. You have rationality built in, and you have the capacity to use your reason to figure out what is the right thing to do, right? Or rather, to figure out what things should you not do. That puts it better. Morality respects all rational creatures equally, right? If your behavior towards other people is puts moral demands on you, not because other people are vulnerable or, you know, they are your peasants and so you owe them you owe them your protection or anything like that. No, you relate to other people as one rational agent to another. So you can see that this is very much the Enlightenment thing. It's universalist and it's egalitarian, right? We're all examples of rationality. We're all rational agents capable of moral deliberation, and that is why we should all be equally respected. You can see it. This. You can think of this, if you want, as a kind of secular version of the idea that we're all equal before God. Okay, what is the point of morality? Well, the point of morality is not to make you happy. Kant says in the groundwork that the point of reason, nothing. Okay, so part of the religious background is providentialism. Everything has a purpose. Right? He thinks that's obvious. Everything's been created by God with a purpose. What's the purpose of human reason? Well, it can't be happiness, because people who try to reason their way to happiness almost always fail, right? Just, look around. So what then is the point of reason? Well, it is for us to work out what is the moral thing to do, and the point of morality is to be worthy of happiness, right? So, and it's derived from reason. It's therefore within each person, and again, that's an Enlightenment thing. So traditionally, there were moral experts. Just as there are medical experts and legal experts, if you want to know what you should do in some legally difficult situation, you go and ask a lawyer. And if you want to know, you want medical advice, you go to your doctor. For in medieval Europe, if you wanted to know what to do morally, the kind of standard idea was that you have to ask a moral expert. In other words, a father confessor, a priest. How could you, just like an ordinary person, how could you possibly know? How could you possibly have expert moral knowledge? I mean, that's as ridiculous. Just by being a person, how could you have expert moral knowledge just by being a person? That's just as ridiculous as the idea that you have expert medical knowledge just because you have a body, right? That's the medieval kind of idea. Come the Enlightenment, that gets turned over. In the Enlightenment, we get the idea that no, each person is as good a moral expert as any other. Why, says Kant? Well, because we are all rational agents. We've all got the means for figuring out the moral truth built in. So, morality unconditionally values the good will, right? The will motivated by duty. So what does that mean? Well, what does unconditional valuing mean? It means that the goodwill is the only thing that's always valuable, right? So courage is usually valuable unless somebody is using it for a bad purpose, right? So somebody could be a courageous robber, think about the more dangerous kinds of robbery, like armed robbery, and somebody who goes for it, is unafraid. So courage is only conditionally valuable. It's only valuable if it's being used for some good purpose. And so on. I'm not gonna run through a lot of other examples, but you can see how that's going to be the case for every other virtue, every other thing that you might think. So, wealth or whatever. They're all conditionally valuable. The goodwill is the only thing that is unconditionally valuable. And you can't value it excessively, right? So you might say, well, yes, this person values courage, but they overdo it, right? I mean, yes, courage is important, but it's not the only thing. Come on. You can't do that with the goodwill. And the last important point, he is not trying to defeat the moral skeptic, right? So sometimes in ethics classes, the moral skeptic turns up and it's like, why should we be good at all? Right? Why should I even be interested in doing the right thing? That's not the question that Kant is trying to answer. His project is more like, because apart from anything else, he doesn't think that any human being is altogether depraved. He says that, I think, somewhere in the Critique of Pure Reason, the first critique. He says that, even the most hardened criminal, there's some little glimmer of the beginnings of moral understanding, which, if you blow on those embers, you might eventually get return them to being a sort of fully moral person. So he doesn't think that there really are moral skeptics. He doesn't think that anybody is in fact utterly depraved. It's more like we have this concept of morality. Morality is already up and running as a practice, as a concept. We have it and we can't shake it off, right? So there are some concepts you could imagine us not using, like fondue, We have the concept of a communal pot of melted cheese into which we dip bits of bread, but we don't have to have that. We don't have to have that practice. And if we didn't have the practice, we wouldn't need to have the concept. Morality isn't like that. We seem to be stuck with the concept. So let's unpack it. Let's unpack that concept and figure out what it says and what it entails. That's Kant's project. And he's not a fool about human motivations. He knows that human motivations are complex. He says, again, in the groundwork, he says, if we look into the motive for any action, we always find the dear self, right? Nobody's motives are just unmixed. There's always a bit of selfishness, always a bit of self-regard, a bit of amour propre built in to the complex motivations we have for anything we do. And he says, look, it's quite possible that there never was in the history of all humanity a perfectly moral act. It's quite likely that every action ever taken by any human had mixed, complex motives that involved some self-regard. But even if there never ever was, in fact, any purely moral action, that's to say, any action that was entirely motivated by the goodwill, still, we want to know what the concept of morality is, what its structure is, what it entails. So he's not altogether naive about human nature. Okay. Just consider the alternatives. So morality, according to Kant, does not consider outcomes. What makes a moral action moral is the motive, duty. So the comparison here is with consequentialism. There's a picture of John Stuart Mill looking all Victorian. Kantian ethics, Kantian morality doesn't consider outcomes. It's about the motive. What makes a moral act moral is that it's morally motivated. Nor does morality consider what kind of creature we are or how we live. So here's Aristotle as painted by Raphael, top right there. In Aristotle's ethics, it matters very much what kinds of creatures we are. It matters that we are sociable creatures. We need to live in society and have complex relationships with other people. And because we have those needs, that has an effect on the kind of virtues that are important for animals like us. If we were social but in a different way, like bees, then we would require different virtues of each other. Or if we were solitary creatures, like tigers, then the virtues of sociability wouldn't mean anything to us, right? So for Aristotle, the biology, the anthropology, the political philosophy, and the ethics are all one grand study of the human condition. Not for Kant. For Kant, it doesn't matter what kind of creature we are or how we live. All that matters is that we are rational. Comes from within us, right? The knowledge of the moral law is built in to humans because we have rationality built in. So that's different from divine command theory. So here's Charlton Heston in the role of Moses holding the tablets of the law to illustrate the idea of law being given to you from outside. So that's divine command theory, where you are a broken, sinful creature in need of salvation. You need somebody to tell you what morality is. You need someone to give moral laws to you. That's not the way we are according to Kant. According to Kant, we have rationality and therefore the possibility of moral understanding built in. And finally, bottom right is David Hume. Kantian moral theory is epistemically egalitarian. So everybody, even the most hardened criminal, has rationality, is a rational agent, and is therefore capable of moral understanding. Whereas if you think that morality is driven, is shaped by feeling, right? Hume, remember, says that morality is more felt than judged of, right? It's about your feelings. Well, some people have finer feelings than others. So in sentiment theory, in Hume and people like him, some people really are more morally sensitive than others, and they're going to be better at figuring out what's right. And that's, in the 18th century, that was part of the argument for studying art, for looking at fine art and going to the theatre and so on, to train up your feelings, to make you capable of more refined feelings. Not Kant. Kant's having none of that. Okay, so here's his, not his gravestone, but his monument, which is in Königsberg. But this is written in, you can see, in German, also in Russian. He says, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence, the more often and more steadily one reflects on them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Right? Remember, he spent all that time teaching natural science and mathematics and astronomy and so on. So the starry heavens above, and there was far less light pollution in his day than in ours, so they really were starry. And you need to get hold of the idea of heteronymous motives. So I've sort of illustrated it here. So if I eat some food because I'm hungry, I'm acting for a motive that's outside my will, outside my reason. The feeling of hunger is inside my body, so it's intimate to me, but it's outside my reason. But if I choose not to eat that food because it belongs to someone else, and my reason tells me that stealing is wrong, I'm acting autonomously. I'm giving law to myself, right? So autonomos. Auto, self, nomos, law. Autonomos, self-legislating. So in other words, the best, the most human part of me is in charge, namely my rational will. So you're getting a sense now, there's a powerful sense of human dignity in an egalitarian human dignity in Kant's philosophy, but it's tied to rationality, it's tied to our capacity to reason. So getting into the technicalities now, he distinguishes between categorical and hypothetical imperatives. So a hypothetical imperative, if you want to do this, do that, right? If you want, I don't know, if you want to be fitter, take more exercise, right? And if you don't care about fitness, don't worry. Categorical means just do it. There's no if then, there's just you must do this. And moral imperatives are categorical. That's all you really need to remember. There's no if you want to achieve this end. No, there's no ifs and buts for moral imperatives, that you just do this, or rather don't do that. There's a lot of talk in Kantian ethics about willing, and willing doesn't just mean desiring. It means you commit yourself to it, right? So I might desire to be fitter, but I'm only really willing myself to be fitter if I commit to it, form a plan, do something about it. I've got my example here with cake. Okay. Just filling out the vocabulary. So what's a maxim? You hear the word maxim. A maxim is a general instruction, such as always carry a handkerchief or never pat a stray dog. And it's not so, notice that the generality, right? So it's not like kiss your grandma or don't hit your sister, right? They're not specific instructions. They are general things. Everyone every day should carry a handkerchief. Nobody ever should pat a stray dog. And that's not surprising that they should be general instructions when you consider that, according to Kant, morality is necessary and a priori, because it's general statements that you would expect to get out of necessary a priori reasoning. Okay. If you've done Kant already, you will have come across the three formulations. I should say that amongst Kant scholars, there's some dispute about exactly how many formulations there are. If you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy pages about Kant's ethics, which I recommend you do. I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is the best online resource for philosophy. It's at quite a high level. It's generally, it shouldn't be the first thing that you read when you start a new philosophy topic, but you should get to it because it's really good. It's written by real experts. In the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they count four. Whoever wrote that article reckons that there are four formulations. I've seen arguments for five. I find that a bit sketchy. Anyway, because three is the kind of standard thing, I've gone with three. So here we are. And you notice that they all look quite different. So there's the formula of the universal law of nature. So the universalization test, right? Only act in accordance with maxims which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Then you've got the humanity formula. Never act in such a way that we treat humanity, whether in ourselves or others, as a means only, but always. And the important thing there is the word only, because people get this wrong. You can use another human being as a means to an end, but you must recognize at the same time that that person is an end in themselves. And then there's the kingdom of ends formula. act in accordance with the maxims of a member, giving universal laws for a possible kingdom of ends. Don't be misled by the word kingdom. It could be a republic, right? It's just a structured society of rational moral agents. If you had a structured society of rational moral agents, what laws would they write for themselves? That's one way of thinking about morality. So let's just sort of step through them. So the first one, universal law of nature. Notice that it appeals to us both as lawgivers and as law takers, which we are both of those things, because we are autonomous, we're giving law to ourselves. And he gives these two tests. A maxim must be conceptually coherent and it must be practically rational. Right? If a maxim is contradictory in conception, then you have a perfect maximal duty not to do it, right? So his example is lying. Lying is conceptually incoherent because the whole business of telling a lie depends on the practice of truth-telling. But if you allow lying to be universally allowed, then it will become impossible. And that doesn't mean, what if everybody did it? That means what's built. I think a clearer example actually is theft. So if you imagine you're thinking about stealing somebody's bike, right? There's a bike there, unchained, vulnerable. And you look at it, and at that moment when you look at that bike, you suspend the concept of property. You sort of set aside the fact that it belongs to somebody. You treat it as if it was a pebble on the beach or a branch lying on the floor of the forest, right? It's just there. Then, once you've seized it, you don't just want to have possession of it, you want to own it. You want it to become your bike. But to do that, you've got to reach for the concept of property, right? But you can't have it both ways. Either the concept of property applies to bikes or it doesn't. And if it applies to bikes, it applies to that bike before you've laid hands on it. And if it doesn't apply to bikes, then it doesn't apply to it after you've grabbed it, right? So stealing is conceptually incoherent. Okay. And then he lined up with the distinction between conceptual incoherence and kind of practical incoherence. He has a distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. So if you have, if something is conceptually incoherent, then you have a perfect duty not to do it. So he thinks that we have a perfect duty to ourselves not to commit suicide. He thinks that committing suicide is itself an incoherent thing to do. And he thinks that lying is conceptually incoherent. And so you just shouldn't do either of them at all. We have imperfect duties to ourselves. So, for example, you have a duty to develop your talents. And we also have a duty to others to contribute to their happiness. But notice, part of what makes them imperfect is that the moral law doesn't tell you exactly how to do that and in what proportions. So supposing you have a talent for sport and for mathematics, it doesn't tell you, whether you should divide your time evenly or whether you should focus on one more than the other, or, how much time you should spend becoming better at sport versus how much time you should spend contributing to other people's happiness, right? It doesn't tell you any of those things. It just says you should put some effort in these directions, right? So that's part of what's imperfect about them. Now you might wonder, I wonder about this, is whether the perfection of perfect duties lines up with the incoherence of things, of maxims that are contradictory in conception. Whether those two distinctions between contradictory in conception and contradictory in practical terms, whether that distinction always lines up neatly with the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Okay, got my eye on the clock here, so I will jog along. The humanity formula. You can treat humans as a means so long as you can hire somebody to as a rickshaw driver, right? So you're just using that person as a means. You could have been a horse, could have been an engine, but as long as in the act of doing so you respect their humanity, so they've got to be employed, or have been rationally persuaded, or leaned on for a favor or something. You've asked them nicely, but they mustn't be enslaved, because if you enslave somebody, you're using them as a means only, and you mustn't do that. But notice what's valued here is not us, but our humanity, our capacity for moral. So if you look in detail, and I recommend you do this, look in detail at his argument for the wrongness of suicide. What he says is that you kill humanity in yourself for some selfish person, for some selfish reason. There's a similar argument he makes for the wrongness of masturbation. The trouble with that is that he's so disgusted by the topic that he can barely bring himself to write with any kind of clarity. But it is, insofar as you can discern an argument, it's the same sort of thing. It's what's important is not you, the complete feeling human being, but rather that rational agency that's built into you. That's what has to be preserved, even if that's a bad time for you, right? So you can imagine if you were a soldier and you've been badly wounded and everybody else is retreating, and you know that and you can't move because you're injured, so and your enemy's advancing, so you know that if you just lie there, you will be taken prisoner and you will be tortured because they're that kind of enemy. It might not be you might think it's not unreasonable to commit suicide at that point, and you've got weapons, right? So you can. Kant would say no, right? Because what matters is not the total person, the total organism, which is now, suffering from its wounds and will later suffer from torture. What matters is that that capacity for rational moral agency, which Kant calls our humanity. And you can see there's the beginning of the critique right there. The kingdom of ends, as I said, it's just what laws would a society of rational moral agents make for itself? I'm running out of time here, so I won't go long on this, but just notice if you've done political philosophy, you've done Rousseau and the state of nature, this device of imagining some rational moral agents, standing in a forest clearing in a place where there is as yet no government, asking what kind of government would we invent, is already by Kant's time a standard move. It's already there in Rousseau, it's already there in Hobbes. Okay, and later you get it in Rawls's theory of justice. All right. Now Kant says that these formulas are all in some sense the same. What does that mean? Well, some standard options. Option one is to say they all mean the same thing. That seems, I mean, they don't seem to be saying the same thing. So let's set that aside. Option two is that they could be logically derived from each other, which is more plausible, but it's difficult. Have a go. Do the exercise. Write down the first formulation, the universalization test, and see if you can logically derive from that the second formulation. And then from the second formulation, the third, and then from the third, see if you can derive the first formulation. Have a go. If they were all logically equivalent, you should be able to do that. Really, more plausibly, the option is that they supply the same set of rules. Maybe that's what he meant. Okay, I've got a couple of minutes for critiques. One is that there are rational moral agents aren't the only things that matter. Dogs matter, animals matter. Any creature capable of experiencing pain should be morally important to us. Now, Kant knows this, and he gives an argument. He says, you shouldn't be cruel to your dog because if you are in the habit of being cruel to animals, it's more likely that you'll be cruel to another human being, and that's morally wrong. And you think, well, yes, that is a reason for not being cruel to dogs. But surely the really compelling reason for not being cruel to dogs is that it hurts the dog. And if you have a moral theory where there isn't space to say that, then something seems to have been missed out. Next point. Consequences sometimes matter. It's really tough to sustain you think of, occasions when would be really important to tell a lie. I mean, the standard one is if, the Gestapo are looking for somebody innocent and they ask you if you know where they are, and the truth is you do, you can lie to the Gestapo, right? The consequences of not lying to the Gestapo would be bad. Other things matter, virtues matter, including virtues of partiality. So you imagine that you're in hospital and you get two visitors. One of them is somebody who knows you and likes you, enjoys your company, loves you, wants you to get better, hates the thought of you lying in hospital all lonely and ill and miserable on your own. And because they care about you personally, not just any sick person, but you, because you are an important person in their life. Because of that, they come and visit you and try and cheer you up. Your other visitor visits you out of a sense of duty because they've read Kant. Which one do you want, right? Which visit do you look forward to? And that arguably is a moral difference, right? There is an argument that you get in Hegel that his principles are so abstract that actually it's not surprising that the morality he ends up with is exactly the morality that you would get if you asked any respectable bourgeois person in Königsberg at that time, right? He's against lying, he's against stealing, he's against murder. Okay. So maybe what really matters is whatever it is that fixes the ethics in the first place, and all of this giving a rational basis stuff is just kind of decorative. And the last criticism I want to mention is that not every incoherent maxim is immoral. So here's the point. Here are two reasons for not doing something. One is it's immoral. That's a good reason for not doing something. Another good reason for not doing something is that it's conceptually or practically incoherent. That's also a good reason, but they're not the same. So, for example, if you decide that you want to go and live in a wilderness where no human person has lived before, well, you can do that on day one, but by day two, you can't. Why? Because there's a human person that's already lived there, you, right? That's incoherent, but it's not immoral to try and do that. It just, my favorite example, supposing you decide as a piece of politeness that you're going to shake hands with the dominant hand of whoever you meet. So if you meet a right-handed person, you extend your right hand. If you meet a left-handed person, you extend your left hand. That's a perfectly nice maxim that you could live by, but you couldn't universalize it, right? Because if everybody went around doing that, what happens when a right-hander meets a left-hander? So that would be impossible to universalize because of, the structure of space, but it wouldn't be immoral to try and do that. Anyway, I'm now over time, so I'm just going to end with a story. So in the United States of America, you can join the police without having finished your high school education. But if you want to you want to be promoted to captain, you need your high school diploma, right? So you need to finish all your credits. So in adult education colleges in the States, you occasionally meet police sergeants who are busy topping up their high school credits so they can finally get their high school graduation and they can then apply to be promoted to captain. And in one of these classes is a philosophy ethics class. And there's a police sergeant who's taking ethics for credit. But while he's doing that, he has a great success. He arrests a big local gangster, and it's in the newspapers. There's a big photograph. So the next class, the philosophy teacher says, "Hey, I saw you had this great success. You arrested that big local gangster." And the policeman says, "Yeah, and I tell you, I would have plugged that guy as well. But then I remembered what Kant said."